His phone rang at 8:12 p.m. 4 minutes later, Diana was standing barefoot in the snow with divorce papers in her shaking hands, accused of laundering money for a Mafia boss she'd never met. Then a black SUV rolled into the empty terminal, and the most feared man in the city crouched in front of her, studied her face like he already knew the truth, and asked one question. What happened? If this story pulled you in, go ahead and subscribe so you never miss what's ahead. I've got another unforgettable story coming tomorrow. And while you're here, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing people tuned in from all over the world. Okay, let's get back into it. The snow didn't fall that night. It descended thick, purposeful, the kind that erases the world one layer at a time until nothing familiar remains. Diana Swift sat alone on a metal bench at the empty bus terminal, her bare shoulders pulled inward against the cold. The burgundy evening dress she'd worn to dinner offered nothing against the winter. No sleeves, no back. Just thin satin clinging to skin that had long since gone numb. In her hands, crumpled and beginning to soften at the edges from the falling snow, were papers she still didn't fully understand. Divorce papers. She hadn't signed anything. She hadn't been asked to. They'd simply been placed in her hands as the door closed. An hour ago, she had been setting down her wine glass. The table had been properly laid, white plates, candles, the kind of quiet Tuesday dinner that required no occasion. Her husband had been speaking about something from work, and she had been half listening the way people do when a conversation is comfortable enough not to need full attention. Then his phone rang. She hadn't thought anything of it, not at first. He'd glanced at the screen, excused himself, and stepped into the hallway. She had reached for her glass. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. She knew because she'd watched the candle and thought about nothing in particular while she waited for him to come back. When he did, the man who returned to the dining room was not the man who had left it. His face had gone the specific color of someone who has just been told something they cannot unknow. His jaw was set. His eyes, when they finally found her across the table, held something colder than anger. They held decision. "You lied to me," he said. She set down her glass. "What?" "The accounts. The transfers." He was speaking carefully, the way people speak when they are afraid of what they might say if they stop being careful. "They said your name is on all of it, that you've been laundering money." A pause. For Dragos Sava. The name meant nothing to her in that moment. It would mean everything later. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said. And she didn't. Not a single word of it made sense. "Who called you? What accounts?" But his face had already closed. She saw it happen. Watched him decide that the voice on the phone was more credible than the woman across the dinner table from him. Watched 7 years narrow into a single phone call from an anonymous number. "I need you to leave," he said. She had stood slowly. "You can't be serious." He had walked to the door and opened it. The hallway outside was cold. She'd remembered, distantly, that her coat was hanging by the entrance. She'd moved toward it. His hand had come out and stopped her at the arm, not violently, but firmly. The papers had appeared from somewhere. She still didn't know when he'd printed them. "Take these," he said. "We're done." The door had closed. She had stood in the hallway for a moment that felt much longer than it was. The neighbors' doors stayed shut. The corridor stayed empty. She had walked to the elevator in her dinner dress and her heeled shoes and pressed the button for the ground floor. The bus terminal had been the only place within walking distance with a roof. Now the papers trembled in her hands. The ink from his signature was beginning to blur in the snow. She stared at it, at the legal language that reduced 7 years to clauses and dates, and felt the particular hollowness of a person who has run out of reactions. She was not crying anymore. She had done that in the first 20 minutes. What remained now was something quieter and harder, the feeling of solid ground giving way to nothing, and realizing you'd been standing on it for years without checking. The terminal was empty. The last bus schedule posted on the shelter wall showed nothing running after 11. She had nowhere to go that she could think of clearly enough to name. She pressed her palm against her bare arm and held it there. Then headlights swept through the snow. A black SUV moved slowly into the terminal. Too slowly for someone passing through. It pulled to the curb directly in front of her and stopped. Diana didn't move. The driver's door opened. The man who stepped out was tall, broad through the shoulders, unhurried in every movement. He wore a black suit without a tie, his white collar open at the throat, and even in the blue-washed light of the terminal she could see the tattoos. Dark, elaborate ink beginning at his hands and climbing past his wrists, disappearing beneath his cuffs, reappearing at his collar and traveling up the left side of his neck. His hair was close-cropped, dusted at the crown with snow. His face was angular and still, the face of someone who had trained himself long ago not to betray anything he hadn't chosen to show. He looked at her with dark, unreadable eyes. Behind him, 3 children climbed quietly from the vehicle. A girl, perhaps 11, dark-eyed and watchful beneath a knit hat, stepped out first. And behind her, 2 younger boys in winter coats, their small faces serious above their scarves. They didn't wander. They stayed close together, watching the woman on the bench the way children watch something they sense the adults around them consider important. The man walked toward her. He stopped 2 feet away. His gaze moved to the papers in her hands briefly, deliberately, then returned to her face. Then he crouched. He lowered himself to her eye level, with the easy precision of someone physically comfortable with stillness, his tattooed hands resting loosely on his knees, snowflakes catching on the shoulders of his black jacket. This close, she could see that his eyes weren't simply dark, they were the kind of dark that had seen a great deal and filed it all away. He did not look like a man offering charity. He looked like a man who had already made a calculation and arrived at a conclusion. One of the younger boys drifted a half-step forward and tugged at the man's sleeve. "She looks scared," the boy whispered. The man said nothing, but something behind his eyes shifted so slightly she almost missed it. He studied her face for a moment longer. The divorce papers, her bare, reddened shoulders, the shoes that had never been made for standing in snow. Then, quietly and without ceremony, he asked, "What happened?" Diana Swift looked up at the man the city whispered about in careful voices, and for the first time since the door had closed behind her, she didn't know whether the danger was behind her or crouching right in front of her, waiting to hear her answer. She knew the name. Everyone in the city knew the name. Dragos Sava. It moved through conversations the way smoke moves through a room quietly, until you realized it had already reached every corner. She had heard it at dinner parties spoken in lowered voices, at office corridors disguised as casual mention, in news segments that never quite said enough to be actionable. A name attached to fear the way certain names simply are not because of what can be proven, but because of what everyone understands without proof. And he was crouching in front of her in the snow, waiting for an answer she didn't know how to give. "I don't know," she said. Her voice came out thin and strange, like something that had been left out in the cold too long. "I don't. There was a phone call. My husband received a call and then he—" She stopped. The explanation felt absurd spoken aloud. "He threw me out." Dragos said nothing immediately. He simply looked at her, not with pity, not with skepticism, with the focused attention of someone processing information rather than reacting to it. "How long have you been sitting here?" he asked. She didn't know that either. Time had done something strange after the elevator doors opened onto the empty street. "A while," she said. He nodded once, as if that answered more than she'd intended it to. Then he stood, and in one motion shrugged his jacket from his shoulders. He held it out to her, not draped, not placed gently, just held out at arm's length, the way practical people offer practical things. She stared at it. "You'll lose fingers before anyone finds you," he said flatly. "Take it." It wasn't kindness, exactly. It was efficiency. The distinction mattered to her in ways she couldn't articulate because kindness would have required something from her in return. This required nothing. She took the jacket. It was warm in the way that things are warm when they've been close to someone immediately, almost uncomfortably so. She pulled it around her shoulders and felt the cold ease by a fraction. The older girl, serious-faced, watchful beneath her knit hat, moved closer to the younger boys and said nothing. But her eyes remained on Diana, not unkindly, just steady, the way children are steady when they have learned that the world contains things worth paying careful attention to. Dragos spoke a single word in a low voice toward the SUV. The driver, a broad, silent man Diana hadn't noticed until now, stepped out and stood at a respectful distance. A signal, she understood, not to the driver, for her benefit, so she could see that things were being arranged. "I'll take you somewhere warm," Dragos said. "You can decide what comes next once you're not freezing." "I don't need," she started. "You're sitting alone at a closed bus terminal in a dinner dress." His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "Whatever you were about to say after that, I'd reconsider." She closed her mouth. It was not that she trusted him. She didn't. She was not naive enough to mistake the absence of an immediate threat for safety, and she was not so devastated that her judgment had entirely left her. She knew what his name meant. She knew what men like him, men with that kind of stillness, that kind of control, were capable of. But she also knew what the alternative was. Another hour on a metal bench while the temperature dropped and the papers in her hands turned to pulp. No phone, no coat, no answer to the question her husband had never let her ask. She stood. Her legs had stiffened without her noticing. She steadied herself against the back of the bench and straightened slowly, the jacket falling to just above her knees. One of the younger boys, round-faced, blue-hatted, perhaps 5 years old, looked up at her with the unguarded curiosity of someone who had not yet learned to disguise his interest in things. "Your dress is red," he announced. "It is," she said. "Red is a good color," he said seriously, and then turned back to his brother as though the matter were settled. Something cracked open very slightly in Diana's chest. She pressed it closed. The estate sat behind iron gates on the city's northern edge, the kind of property that didn't announce itself. No visible signage, no architectural excess, just high walls and a long driveway, and the particular silence of a place that has been made deliberately difficult to approach. Inside, the house was warm and ordered. Staff moved quietly through wide corridors. Security was present but unobtrusive. She registered it the way you register a current in water. Not visible, but felt. Dragos led her through a hallway and into a sitting room with high ceilings and a fire already burning. He gestured toward the sofa without ceremony. She sat. He remained standing, his hands clasped loosely behind him, and studied her with that same focused, unreadable expression he'd worn at the terminal. "Your husband's name," he said, and the time the call came through. She blinked. "Why?" "Because you didn't do whatever they told him you did." He said it plainly, completely without drama, and I'd like to know who did. The certainty in his voice stopped her. "You don't know me," she said carefully. "You have no reason to." "No," he agreed. "I don't." A pause. "Tell me your husband's name," she told him. He took out his phone and sent a message to someone she couldn't see, then set it face down on the table between them. The fire settled. Outside, through the tall windows, the snow was still falling. "The children," she said, after a silence. "They're yours?" Something moved across his face, brief and contained. "My brother's," he said. "He died 14 months ago." She absorbed that. The older girl's watchful eyes, the younger boy's guileless commentary about her dress, the way all three of them had stood in the snow without complaint, close together, accustomed to following a man who did not explain himself in advance. "I'm sorry," she said. He looked at her. "Are you?" "Yes." He seemed to consider this not as though he doubted her, but as though sincerity was something he had learned to examine carefully before accepting. Then, quietly, "Your husband received that call at 8:12 p.m. Diana's breath stopped. She had not told him the time. She had not told him anything close to the time. "How do you know that?" she asked. Dragos looked at her steadily across the firelight. He didn't answer. And that was, she realized, its own kind of answer entirely. The fire crackled. Diana sat very still, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that someone had placed in front of her without being asked. The jacket, his jacket, still rested across her shoulders. She hadn't taken it off. She told herself it was because she was still cold. "You knew about the call before tonight," she said. It wasn't a question anymore. Dragos stood near the window, his back partially turned, watching the snow collect against the glass. He had the posture of someone accustomed to carrying information the way other people carry weight quietly, without showing the strain. "Yes," he said. "Then you need to tell me what's happening." Her voice was steadier than she felt. "Because 2 hours ago I was having dinner, and now I'm sitting in your house with divorce papers and no coat, and apparently my name is attached to something I have never heard of." She set the cup down. "So tell me." He turned from the window. He crossed the room without hurry, and sat in the chair across from her, not beside her, not looming over her. Across, level. She noticed that he made these choices deliberately. Everything about how he occupied space felt considered. "There is money moving through my organization," he said. "Has been for approximately 4 months. Clean money going in, dirty money coming out, rerouted through civilian accounts. People who have no connection to my work, no knowledge of it." He paused. "Their identities are being used without consent to create distance between the transfers and their source." Diana listened. When the accounts are eventually flagged, and they are designed to be flagged, the paper trail leads to ordinary people. People who cannot defend themselves against a federal investigation because they don't understand what they're being accused of. He held her gaze. "Your name appeared in the flagged accounts 11 days ago." The room was very quiet. I didn't open any accounts, she said. I know. I don't have any connection to. I know, he said again. The same tone, the same certainty he had offered her in the sitting room before, and the same effect it didn't comfort her so much as it steadied something. That's why I started looking. She pressed her fingers flat against her knees. Who is doing this? Someone inside my organization. The words came out measured, but beneath them she heard something that wasn't quite anger. It was older than anger. The controlled fury of a man who had trusted carefully and been betrayed anyway. Someone who wants federal investigators looking at my operation. Someone creating a smoke trail through innocent people's lives to get there. And my name was chosen randomly. A pause. Fractional. Just long enough to tell her the answer before he gave it. No, he said. The fire shifted. A log gave way and resettled, sending a brief curl of light across the ceiling. Your father, Dragos said. His name was Andre Swift. She went very still. He died 6 years ago, she said carefully. He did. But before that, 18 years ago, he testified in a federal corruption case, one that involved 3 crime families operating across the Northeast. He watched her face. The testimony was sealed, his name was protected, but these things are never completely buried, not from the people who know where to look. Another pause. The rival family connected to that case has been dormant for years. They've resurfaced recently, and someone with access to my internal records has a relationship with them. Diana stared at him. She was a financial analyst. She understood structures, how money moved, how systems were built, how people hid things inside legitimate frameworks. She understood, in a technical sense, exactly what he was describing. What she could not yet process was that her father, quiet, principled, a man who had taken her to the library every Saturday until she was 12, had apparently carried something into his grave that had just destroyed her marriage. He never told me, she said. Her voice was different now. Smaller. He wouldn't have, Dragos said, not dismissively. With something that sounded, unexpectedly, like respect. Men who testify in those cases are told to carry it alone. The protection only holds if the circle is small. She looked at the fire. Her father had sat across dinner tables from her for years. He had helped her move into her first apartment. He had shaken her husband's hand at their wedding with a steady grip and genuine warmth. And somewhere underneath all of it, he had been carrying a secret that had just reached forward across 18 years and pulled the floor out from under her. Someone chose my name deliberately, she said slowly. Because of him. Because of what his testimony meant to the people it damaged, Dragos said. You were targeted specifically. The goal was to create a civilian identity with a traceable surname, one that, if investigated, would surface the sealed case, which would raise questions, which would create pressure. He leaned forward slightly. On me, she looked at him then. Really looked past the stillness, past the control, into the thing underneath it. You were thrown out, he said quietly, because someone needed you unprotected, alone, without resources. Without a husband asking questions on your behalf. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. A woman sleeping in a bus terminal doesn't make calls to lawyers, doesn't file reports, doesn't ask the right questions of the right people. The truth of it moved through her like cold water. She had not been discarded out of her husband's fear. She had been placed there. Deliberately. By someone who had calculated exactly what a woman alone in the snow would and wouldn't be able to do. Her hands, she noticed, had stopped shaking. Something had happened in the space of that understanding. Some internal temperature had shifted. The grief was still there. The humiliation of the hallway, the neighbors' closed doors, the divorce papers softening in the snow. All of it was still there, but underneath it, something harder had replaced the hollowness. She looked across at Dragos Sava, a man she had no reason to trust, and every reason to fear, and heard herself say, with a clarity that surprised her, I want to clear my name. He studied her. I have a finance background, she continued. If someone has been running transfers through civilian accounts for 4 months, there will be irregularities, patterns, things that looked clean to someone who wasn't looking for them. She held his gaze. I will find them. The fire settled. Dragos looked at her for a long moment, the look of a man recalibrating something he thought he had already figured out. Then, almost to himself, you were thrown out because someone wanted you weak. His eyes met hers. They miscalculated. She slept in a room she hadn't chosen. It was on the 2nd floor, simply furnished, warm, with heavy curtains drawn against the snow. Someone had laid out clothes before she arrived. A gray knit sweater, dark trousers, thick socks. No note, no explanation. Just practical provision, the way everything in this house seemed to operate without ceremony, without asking what she preferred. She had not expected to sleep. She'd lain on top of the duvet fully dressed and stared at the ceiling and waited for her mind to exhaust itself with the events of the evening. It didn't take long. When she woke, gray winter light was pressing through the curtain edges, and the house was already moving. She could hear it, the low frequency of a large, ordered household beginning its day. Footsteps in corridors. A door closing somewhere below. The distant sound of a child's voice, high and indignant about something, quickly hushed. She dressed in the clothes that had been left. They fit well enough to suggest someone had looked at her carefully, or been told to. She wasn't sure which unsettled her more. The kitchen was at the rear of the house, large, practical, warmed by a range that looked like it ran continuously. A woman named Petra, who introduced herself without being asked, and elaborated on nothing, set a plate in front of Diana without discussion. The children were already at the table. The older girl sat straight-backed over a bowl of something, reading from a tablet propped against a glass. Up close, in daylight, she was striking, dark-eyed and precise in her movements, somewhere between 10 and 12, with the particular self-containment of a child who has learned to take up exactly the space she is given, and no more. Her name, Diana would learn, was Mara. The two boys were less contained. The younger one, the round-faced boy from the terminal, the one who had delivered his verdict on her dress with such authority, was called Pavel. He was 5, and he approached breakfast with the focused intensity of someone who had strong opinions about the ratio of honey to everything else. His brother, Nico, was 7, quieter than Pavel, more watchful, with eyes that moved around a room the way his uncle's did, cataloging. Pavel looked up when Diana sat down. "You stayed," he said. "I did." He considered this, then nodded, apparently satisfied, and returned to his honey. Mara didn't look up from her tablet immediately, but after a moment she said, without inflection, "Uncle Dragos said you're not a guest." Diana paused. "What did he say I was?" Mara looked up then. Her eyes were direct and held no cruelty, just the precision of a child who had learned to listen to exact words. "He said you were staying because it wasn't safe for you to leave yet. A beat. That's different from a guest." "It is," Diana agreed. Something in Mara's expression shifted barely toward approval. She found Dragos in a room off the main corridor that functioned as an office. He was standing behind a wide desk, jacket off, sleeves rolled to the forearm, the tattoos fully visible now in daylight, dark and intricate, covering both forearms from wrist to elbow in patterns that looked less decorative than biographical, like a record of something. He was reading from a document when she knocked at the open door. He looked up. "The children," she said. "Mara told me they're not guests either." He set the document down. "Correct. She's very precise. She's her father's daughter." He said it without breaking rhythm, but something in his jaw tightened fractionally on the word father. Diana stepped into the room. "I want to start looking at the financial records today. You said the transfers began 4 months ago. I need the flagged accounts, the routing sequences, and whatever internal documentation your people have already pulled." He watched her. "You slept 4 hours. I'm aware. The documents will be ready this afternoon." He paused. "Sit down." She sat across the desk, in the chair that faced him. He remained standing. She had noticed he often chose standing when she sat, and sitting when she stood, always adjusting the distance between them so that neither held a positional advantage. She didn't know if it was deliberate. She suspected everything he did was deliberate. "The children," she said. "How long have they been with you?" A beat of silence. Not reluctant considered. 14 months, since my brother was killed." "Killed," she repeated. "Not an accident, then." "It's handled," he said, which meant, "Do not ask further." She didn't. "They seem..." She searched for the right word. "Steady." Something changed in his face. It happened the way it had the previous night, small, contained, but real. A brief unguarding. "They're remarkable," he said, and the simplicity of it, no qualification, no deflection, caught her off guard. This man who chose every word like a chess piece had just offered that one freely. "Pavel told me red is a good color," she said. Dragos looked at her for a moment. Then, almost imperceptibly, the corner of his mouth shifted. not quite a smile. The suggestion of one, glimpsed and gone. He told me the same thing about a fire truck last week, he said. She laughed. It came out before she could decide whether to allow it short and genuine, dissolving as quickly as it arrived. She pressed her lips together. He returned to his documents, but the room felt different than it had a moment ago, like something had been adjusted a single degree. That afternoon, she sat at a temporary desk they set up in the office and began working through the financial documents his team provided. Numbers were familiar ground, structured, logical, governed by rules. Unlike everything else in the past 24 hours, they behaved predictably. She worked for 3 hours without speaking. At some point, Dragos came to stand behind her, not close, not intrusive, just near enough to see the screen. She was midway through a routing sequence when she felt his presence settle at her shoulder. "There," she said, pointing at the screen. "The interval between transactions. It's not random. Someone is controlling the timing manually, not algorithmically. Which means there's a person initiating each transfer, not a system." She looked up at him. "Someone inside your organization is doing this by hand. Someone who wants control. Who doesn't trust automation because automation leaves cleaner records?" Dragos stared at the screen. His expression didn't change, but his voice when it came was very quiet. "That narrows it considerably. Yes," she said, "to people I trust." She held his gaze. "Yes." He straightened, looked at the screen for another moment. Then at her. "I already am," he said, and walked out. Trust, Diana had learned, was a structure. Like any structure, it had load-bearing points, the places where everything else depended. Remove one quietly, and the whole thing could stand for months before anyone noticed the lean. The crack would be there. The damage would be happening. But from the outside, if the remaining walls were strong enough, it could look solid long after it had ceased to be. She thought about this at her temporary desk on the second morning, working through the routing sequences while the house moved around her in its ordered, quiet way. She thought about her husband, about 7 years of what she had believed was mutual architecture, and how a single phone call had revealed the load-bearing point she hadn't known to check. She thought about what it meant that someone inside Dragos Sava's inner circle was doing the same thing to him. The document spread across her desk told a story in the language she knew best. 4 months of transfers. 11 civilian accounts, hers among them. Each account opened with clean documentation, legitimate identification, small initial deposits that would pass cursory review. The money entered quietly and left quickly, routed through 3 intermediary accounts, before landing somewhere that would take considerably more resources to trace. It was good work, technically proficient, carefully layered. But the timing intervals she had identified the previous afternoon kept pulling at her. She pulled up the sequence again and laid the transfer timestamps in a column, stared at them. Then she reached for a second document, internal meeting logs that Dragos's security team had compiled over the same 4-month period. She hadn't asked for them specifically. They'd been included in the package, perhaps as context. She began cross-referencing. It took 40 minutes. When she found it, she sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a long moment, the way you look at something above you when the thing you've discovered is too large to absorb while looking directly at it. Every manual transfer had been initiated within a 6-hour window following an internal security meeting. Every single one. She brought it to Dragos at noon. He was in the rear courtyard, a walled space behind the house, stone-paved and cold, speaking with a man Diana hadn't seen before. Broad, thick-necked, with close-cropped gray at his temples and the particular ease of someone accustomed to standing close to power. He wore his authority the way certain men do, not in his clothing or his posture, but in the way the space around him seemed to defer. Dragos saw her at the courtyard door and said something brief to the man, who nodded and moved inside, passing Diana without acknowledgement. "Who is that?" she asked, as Dragos approached. "Radu," he said. "He's been with me 11 years. A pause. "My most senior lieutenant." Diana looked at the document in her hand. She looked at the doorway through which Radu had just disappeared. Then she handed Dragos the page. He read it standing up, which was how he read everything. She watched his face as he worked through it, the timestamps, the meeting logs, the columns she had marked in the margin with a single straight line. His expression didn't collapse or flare. It moved through something slower and more controlled than either. A man absorbing a confirmation he had perhaps, on some level, already been approaching. When he looked up, his eyes were very still. "You're certain," he said. "The correlation is consistent across all 4 months. 41 transfers. 41 post-meeting windows. The probability that this is coincidence is— I'm not asking about probability, he said quietly. I'm asking if you're certain. She held his gaze. Yes. He looked back at the page. The courtyard was silent except for the wind moving across the stone and the distant sound, from somewhere inside, of Pavel arguing passionately with Nico about something that required significant volume to resolve. The ordinary noise of children against the extraordinary weight of what sat on the paper between them. Dragos folded the document once, precisely, and held it at his side. 11 years, he said. Not to her, not quite to himself. She said nothing. There was nothing useful to say to a man learning that someone he had trusted with, proximity with access, with the interior mechanics of everything he had built, had been dismantling it quietly from inside. She knew something about that. After a moment, he looked at her. You found this in 2 days. The pattern was there, she said. It just needed someone looking for the right thing. My own analysts reviewed these records. They were looking for external intrusion, she said. They weren't looking at themselves. He absorbed that. Then, what else? She had prepared for this question. She went back through what she had noted a secondary pattern in the account names themselves. A subtle alphanumeric structure that suggested the accounts had been created using a system. A mnemonic, possibly. The kind of thing a careful person uses when managing multiple false identities and needing to keep them straight. Whoever built these accounts is organized, she said. They think in systems. They're not impulsive. This wasn't built in a crisis. It was constructed methodically over time, which means it was planned well before it was executed. She paused. This person has been thinking about leaving for longer than 4 months. The transfers are the exit. They're building a position somewhere else, funded by your operation, documented in a way that implicates you to federal investigators and clears their own path out. Dragos was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was controlled in the way that takes significant effort to sustain. They used you as insulation. Yes. They chose your name deliberately, attached it to transfers designed to be discovered, knowing the investigation would surface your father's sealed testimony. His jaw was tight, knowing the resulting scrutiny would bury you, she said. Yes. He turned away from her slightly. Just enough. She understood it wasn't dismissal, it was the movement of a man who needed a moment to contain something before it became visible. She looked at the courtyard wall, gave him that moment. When he turned back, his face was composed. You've done more in 2 days than my entire team managed in 11, he said. Your team was protecting loyalty, Diana said quietly. I don't have any loyalties here to protect. He looked at her steadily. You do now, he said. And somewhere behind them, inside the warm house, Pavel shouted triumphantly, apparently having won whatever argument had required such sustained volume. Neither of them smiled, but the air between them shifted, almost imperceptibly, toward something that hadn't been there before. She was in the library when they told her. It was late afternoon, the winter light already retreating, the sky outside pressing down into a bruised gray. She had been sitting with Mara, who had decided, with the quiet authority she applied to most decisions, that Diana should know what books were worth reading and which were not. The verdict was delivered without condescension, simply as useful information from someone who had considered the matter thoroughly. Diana had been grateful for it, for the hour of ordinary, for the simplicity of a child's certainty in a week that had contained almost none. Then Petra appeared at the library door. There is someone at the gate, she said. He says he's your husband. The word landed differently than it once would have. Not like ownership, not even like history, like something left on a doorstep that you hadn't decided yet whether to bring inside. Mara looked up from her book. She said nothing, but her eyes moved to Diana's face with that particular attentiveness, reading the room the way she always did, quietly, completely. I'll go, Diana said. He was waiting in a small receiving room near the entrance, a room Diana suspected was chosen deliberately. Not the warmth of the sitting room with its fire, not the authority of the office. A neutral space, a room that said, "You are being accommodated, not welcomed." He stood when she entered. He looked wrong somehow, in this context. She had only ever seen him in the architecture of their shared life, their kitchen, their car, their restaurant table. Here, inside these walls, he looked reduced. Not physically. He was the same height, the same lean build, the same face she had looked across the dinner table at for 7 years. But something about the proportions had shifted. He had aged, she thought. 3 days had aged him. Diana. His voice was careful, the voice of a man who had prepared what he was going to say, and was now uncertain whether it was the right thing. She sat. He remained standing for a moment, then seemed to realize that was wrong, and sat also. I know you didn't do it, he said. The accounts, the transfers, I had someone look into it. A lawyer. He pressed on before she could speak. Your name was used without your knowledge. The accounts were opened fraudulently. You have no connection to any of it. She looked at him. I know, she said. He blinked. You already knew? Yes. He absorbed that. How long? Since the night you threw me out. Something moved across his face. A flinch he didn't fully suppress. Diana, He stopped, started again. I was scared. The voice on the phone was convincing. They had documentation, account numbers, transaction records with your signature. It looked real, she said. Yes, it was designed to. I panicked. The word came out compressed, like something he'd been holding at pressure. I know that's not enough. I know what I did. You opened the door, she said quietly. He stopped. You didn't ask me, she continued. You didn't show me what they'd sent you. You didn't give me 30 seconds to look at the documentation or respond to the accusation. She kept her voice even. Not cold even. The distinction felt important. You received a phone call from an anonymous number, and you walked to the door and you opened it. His jaw worked. I was protecting myself. Yes, she said. You were. She had thought, in the days since, about what she would feel when she saw him again. She had anticipated grief, the accumulated grief of 7 years, meeting the specific grief of that hallway, that door, those neighbors who hadn't come out. She had anticipated anger, had perhaps even anticipated the dangerous pull of familiarity, the gravitational field of a shared life. What she felt instead was clarity, the clean, quiet clarity of someone who has been shown something true and cannot afterwards pretend they haven't seen it. I want you to come home, he said. His voice dropped, became something more exposed. I know I have to earn that. I know it won't be easy. But we can speak to someone. We can. You discarded me, she said. The words weren't raised. They didn't need to be. At the first sign of risk, she continued, you chose yourself. Not because you believed I was guilty. You said yourself you panicked. Which means somewhere underneath the panic, you knew, and you still opened the door. She looked at him steadily. That's not fear. That's a choice. Fear is what you feel. Choice is what you do with it. He leaned forward. Diana, you chose yourself, she said. And that's, she paused. Not from emotion, from the careful consideration of a woman who wanted to say the exact true thing. That tells me something I should have understood before now. About what I was, in our life, what function I served. She set her hands flat on her knees. I was fine when I was uncomplicated. The moment I became a liability, I was removed. The room was very quiet. He didn't argue. That was the thing, he didn't argue, which meant some part of him recognized the shape of what she was describing, even if he couldn't yet bear to name it. Where will you go? He asked, quietly. The fight had gone out of his voice. I'll clear my name, she said, and then I'll decide. He looked at her for a long moment. At the gray sweater that wasn't hers. At the room that wasn't hers. At the woman sitting in it who was. He seemed to be understanding. No longer his in the way he had assumed she was. Is it him? He asked. His voice was careful. Sava, no, she said. And then, because it was true and because she was done softening things. But that's not why I'm not coming home. He stood. He moved to the door and stopped there with his hand on the frame, his back to her. I'm sorry, he said. Diana, I know, she said. She did know. That was the complicated part. She believed the apology was real. She believed the fear had been real. She believed, in his way, he had loved her. None of it changed what the door had meant. He left. She sat alone in the receiving room for a long moment, the winter light almost gone now, the room settling into its evening quiet. Then she stood. She did not go after him. She walked back toward the library, where Mara was waiting with a book and a verdict, and the straightforward company of someone who had decided, in her quiet, certain way, that Diana was worth paying attention to. That, Diana thought, was enough for tonight. She heard it first. Not the sound of danger, she wouldn't have recognized that, but the sound of the house changing, the particular frequency of a large, ordered household, shifting from its routine into something else. Footsteps that moved faster than they should. A door closing with more force than necessary. The distant, urgent murmur of men speaking in low voices that carried the shape of urgency without the words. Diana was in the office, cross-referencing a secondary layer of account documentation she'd requested that morning, when Petra appeared in the doorway. "Come with me," Petra said. Not a question. Not a suggestion. Diana stood. "What's happening?" "Now, please." She followed. Petra moved through the corridor with the brisk efficiency of someone who had done this before, not panicked, not explaining, simply executing a sequence that had apparently been established in advance for exactly this kind of moment. They passed the staircase, turned away from the main entrance, moved deeper into the house toward the rear. "The children," Diana said. "Already with Mara. 3rd floor." Diana followed without further question. They reached a room she hadn't been in before, a small, windowless space behind the kitchen that functioned, she realized, as a secondary security post. A monitor on the wall displayed feeds from exterior cameras. 2 of Dragos's security team were already there, speaking rapidly in low voices, eyes on the screens. She looked at the monitors. 3 men at the outer perimeter wall, moving with a coordination that wasn't casual. One of Dragos's guards was down. She could see him at the edge of one frame, motionless on the ground. Her chest tightened. "They came in from the east side," one of the security men said. "Disabled the exterior feed for 40 seconds. It's back up now." He glanced at Diana. A look she recognized, not hostile, but assessing. Calculating the liability of her presence in this room. "Who are they here for?" she asked. He didn't answer. She looked back at the monitors. She already knew. She heard him before she saw him. Dragos's voice in the corridor, not raised, not urgent, but carrying the specific, compressed authority of a man issuing instructions that will be followed without repetition. Then the sound of movement. Several sets of footsteps, the weight of organized response. Then the sounds from outside, brief, controlled. The kind of violence that doesn't announce itself with chaos, but with efficiency, sharp, purposeful, over quickly. Diana stood at the monitor and watched the exterior feeds cycle through angles, tracking movement she could partially interpret and partially not. 4 minutes. That was all it took. Then the courtyard feed showed Dragos crossing the stone with 2 of his men, and between them, hands secured, head lowered, the thick-necked figure of a man she didn't immediately recognize, until she did. He was one of Radu's men. She had seen him twice in the corridor. A background figure. The kind of person you register as furniture in a large household until the moment the furniture reveals itself to be something else entirely. They brought him through the rear entrance. Diana stepped back from the door as they passed. Dragos saw her. He stopped. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No." She looked at the man between his guards. His face was forward, his expression the closed, resigned expression of someone who has taken a calculated risk and lost. "He came for me." It wasn't a question. She had understood it from the monitors, the angle of entry, the timing, the fact that the breach had been targeted at the residential wing rather than the office or the security room. "Yes," Dragos said. Then he moved past her toward the interior. She found him 20 minutes later. He was in the courtyard alone, or what passed for alone, which in this house meant the guards had withdrawn to a visible but non-intrusive distance. He stood with his back to the door, looking at the wall where the breach had occurred, his jacket off despite the cold. The tattoos on his forearms were stark in the winter air. His hands, she noticed, were not entirely steady. She had not seen that before. She stepped outside. He heard her but didn't turn. "You should be inside." "You're outside," she said. He turned then. His face was controlled, that familiar, constructed composure, but underneath it something was burning. Not performed anger, the real thing. The kind that comes not from wounded pride but from something more personal, more specific. "He was going to take you," Dragos said. His voice was very quiet. "Radu ordered it. If they could create a situation where you disappeared, where investigators found a civilian woman connected to my organization had gone missing." He stopped, jaw tight. "It would have been sufficient." "Sufficient for what?" "To bury me." He looked at her steadily. "You've become a liability to him. You found what his own analysts missed. He knows what that means." She absorbed that. The cold moved across her shoulders. "Did you?" She chose the question carefully. "What did you do to him?" "The man they brought in. He's alive. A beat. For now, she heard what sat beneath those two words. The violence that was being held at distance. The decision being deferred. Dragos. She said his name for the first time. It arrived differently than she expected. Not the whispered citywide version. The name passed between careful people. Just a name. Just his. Don't. He looked at her. Don't do what they expect you to do, she said. You said someone is trying to paint a picture of you for federal investigators. Don't give them the brushstrokes. She held his gaze. Keep him alive. Make him talk. Use what he tells you. That's the thing that actually damages Radu. Not this. The courtyard was silent. Dragos looked at her for a long moment the way he sometimes looked at her, when she said something that required him to adjust what he had already decided. She had learned this expression over 5 days. It was the closest thing to surprise she had ever seen on his face. You're asking me to show restraint, he said, on your behalf. I'm asking you not to become what they think you are, she said. There's a difference. He held her gaze. Something moved through him, visible for just a moment, like light through a closing door. Then he turned toward the house and said, without looking back, he'll be kept secure and conscious. She exhaled. He paused at the door, still not turning. Next time they tell you to stay inside, he said quietly. Stay inside. She almost said, there won't be a next time. She didn't. Because standing in his courtyard in the cold, she wasn't certain that was true, and she was, she realized, with some surprise, not entirely sure she wanted it to be. Radu talked. It took 2 days. Not because he was resistant, though he was, initially, in the practiced way of men who have spent years making themselves useful enough to be protected. It took 2 days because Dragos was patient. Because he had learned, somewhere in the architecture of who he had become, that the most damaging confessions are the ones extracted without force, the ones a man arrives at himself, when the walls of his own calculation finally close in. Diana wasn't in the room for any of it. She hadn't asked to be. What she had asked for, what she had spent those 2 days preparing, was different. She wanted the paper trail made public, not whispered through channels, not filed quietly with lawyers who would negotiate it into something manageable. She wanted the fraudulent accounts, the forged signatures, the routing sequences, and the meeting log correlations laid out in language that civilian investigators, journalists, and a federal oversight committee could each follow independently. She built the document herself. 41 transfers, 11 civilian accounts, her name, and 10 others who had never understood why their identities had been compromised. She cross-referenced every transaction against Radu's internal access logs. She mapped the alphanumeric account structure she'd identified, demonstrating the organizational system behind it, proof that this was not opportunistic but premeditated. She included the timeline, beginning 4 months before discovery, and tracing back to the first internal meeting Radu had attended after a known contact with the rival family was established. It was the most precise work she had ever done. On the morning of the 3rd day, she printed 2 copies, placed one on Dragos's desk, kept one for herself. He read it without speaking. When he finished, he looked up. This is everything, he said. Yes, if this goes to federal oversight. It clears my name, she said, and the 10 other civilians. And it demonstrates that your organization was the target of deliberate infiltration rather than the source of the fraud. She held his gaze. It helps you, Dragos, if it's presented correctly. He looked at the document. You'd be making yourself visible. I'm already visible, she said. Radu made sure of that. The only question now is whether I'm visible as a suspect or as the person who unraveled it. He was quiet for a long moment. This requires you to stand in front of it, to put your name on it publicly. Yes, and you're prepared for that. She thought about the bench at the bus terminal, the divorce papers softening in the snow, the neighbors' closed doors, the hallway and the hand on her arm, and the door that had simply closed. Someone decided I was disposable, she said. They designed an entire financial structure around the assumption that I would be too frightened or too broken to fight back. She picked up her copy of the document. I want them to understand what they miscalculated. The meeting was arranged for the following morning. Dragos's lawyers facilitated access to a federal oversight liaison, a woman named Kovacs, precise and unreadable, who arrived with 2 colleagues and a recording device and sat across a wide table from Diana with the expression of someone who had heard many stories and believed very few of them. Dragos was present. He sat at the far end of the table and said almost nothing. This had been discussed. Diana's voice needed to lead this, unmediated by his presence or his reputation. He was there as a witness, not an authority. Diana sat alone on her side of the table. She placed her document in front of Kovacs and began. She walked through it methodically, the account structure, the timing correlations, the meeting log cross-referencing. She explained the alphanumeric pattern in the account names and what it demonstrated about the level of premeditation involved. She connected Radu's access logs to each transfer window. She named the other 10 civilians whose identities had been used, and she provided the documentation showing each of them had no knowledge of the accounts bearing their names. When she reached the section documenting her own fraudulent accounts, the ones that had been designed to surface her father's sealed testimony and create federal pressure on Dragos's operation, she did not look away from Kovacs. She held eye contact and stated each fact cleanly. Kovacs's expression shifted once, briefly, when Diana reached the section on her father, something that might, in a less controlled face, have become surprise. When Diana finished, the room was quiet. Kovacs looked at the document. At Diana. At the document again. "You compiled this yourself," she said. "Yes." "In how long?" 5 days. A pause. "You have a finance background." "Yes." "But I was also motivated," Diana said simply. Kovacs almost smiled. Almost. The meeting lasted 3 hours. Diana answered every question. She did not soften anything, did not negotiate around the edges of what the documentation showed. She let it be exactly what it was, precise, evidenced, and complete. At the door, as Kovacs was leaving, she stopped. "The 10 other civilians," she said. "I'll need their contact information to initiate remediation." "I have it," Diana said. "I'll send it today." Kovacs nodded, looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone revising an initial assessment. Then she left. Diana stood at the empty table. The document still spread across it. The recording device gone. The room returned to its ordinary dimensions. She heard Dragos move behind her. He stopped at her shoulder close, but not touching. She could feel the warmth of him, the solidity. "You didn't hide behind me once," he said. "No," she said. "He thought you would." A pause. "Radu." He built the entire structure around the assumption that a woman implicated in financial fraud would go quiet. Find a lawyer. Manage it privately. Another pause. He didn't account for someone who would open it up instead. She looked at the document on the table. At her name on the cover page, clear and unequivocal. "He chose the wrong person," she said. Behind her, very quietly, Dragos said, "Yes." And the way he said it, not as assessment, not as strategy, made her close her eyes briefly against something she wasn't ready to name. That evening, Radu's confession was filed alongside Diana's documentation. By morning, the accounts were frozen. By afternoon, the federal investigation had formally shifted its classification from civilian fraud to organized infiltration, with Dragos's organization listed as the target rather than the perpetrator. Diana's name was cleared in a press statement that she did not read until Mara brought it to her on a tablet with characteristic directness. "It says you're not a criminal," Mara said. "I know," Diana said. "Did you know before it said so?" Diana looked at her. "Yes." Mara nodded, satisfied. She took the tablet back and returned to her book. Pavel, from across the room, looked up from whatever engineering project he had been constructing from objects he was not supposed to use for engineering. "Can we have cake?" he asked. Diana laughed. It came from somewhere real, somewhere that had been closed for a long time. It moved through her without asking permission, and she let it, because she was tired of deciding what to allow. "Yes," she said, "I think we can have cake." Her husband called that evening. She saw the name on the phone they had returned to her and looked at it for one full ring. Then she answered. "I saw the statement," he said. "Diana, I know," she said. "I should have." "Yes," she said. "You should have." A long silence. "I'm glad you're safe," he said finally. His voice was very quiet. The voice of a man who has run out of arguments and arrived, too late, at something simpler. "Thank you," she said. She meant it, completely, without anger, without residue. She ended the call. She sat with the phone in her hands for a moment. Then she set it down on the desk and looked out the window at the courtyard, where the snow had finally stopped falling and the stone was pale and still in the evening light. She thought about doors, about the ones that close and the ones that open, about the difference between an ending and a clearing. Then she went to find where the cake had ended up, and did not look back. The snow came back that night. Not the heavy, swallowing kind from the night she had sat at the terminal. Lighter than that. The kind that falls without urgency, that drifts at angles and catches the light and makes the world look briefly, temporarily, like something that has been forgiven. Diana stood at the tall window in the sitting room and watched it come down. The house was quiet in the particular way it went quiet after the children were in bed, not empty, but settled. The security presence withdrew to its perimeter. The staff moved through their closing routines. The building exhaled. She had a glass of wine she wasn't really drinking. She heard him before she saw him, the specific weight of his footsteps, which she had learned without meaning to, the way you learn the sounds of a house you have occupied long enough for it to stop being foreign. He entered the sitting room and stopped when he saw her at the window. He didn't leave. He moved to stand beside her instead, not close enough to require acknowledgement, close enough to share the view. Outside, the snow drifted through the courtyard light in slow, pale arcs. Neither of them spoke for a while. This had become, over the past days, a kind of language between them, the capacity to occupy silence without filling it. She had not experienced this with many people. Most people, she had found, were frightened of silence. They rushed to cover it, to furnish it with words that meant less than the quiet would have. Dragos was not frightened of it. He stood beside her and watched the snow and said nothing, and she stood beside him and did the same, and it was enough. Then he said, without turning, "I need to tell you something." She waited. He was quiet for another moment, not hesitating. She had learned to distinguish this, but organizing. He was a man who did not speak until he knew exactly what he intended to say. "The night at the terminal," he began, "when I stopped. Yes, I told you I had been tracking the internal fraud, that your name appeared in the flagged accounts, and I began investigating." He paused. "That's true, but it's not complete." She turned to look at him. He kept his eyes on the window, on the snow. His profile in the low light was composed, sharp-cut jaw, the tattoo at his collar, the particular stillness that was his resting state, but something underneath it was different tonight. Something had been released from its usual tension. 6 weeks before that night, he said, there was a charity function, a fundraiser for a children's hospital. I attended for reasons that aren't relevant. A brief pause. You were there. She thought back. The charity function in November. She had attended with a colleague. She remembered the room, high ceilings, candlelight, the particular noise of a large formal gathering. "I don't remember seeing you," she said. "You weren't meant to." He turned from the window then, looked at her directly, the way he did when he had decided to commit to something. "You were speaking with someone near the entrance. There had been a problem with the event, a venue issue, I think. A member of the organizing team was distressed. You had stopped. You weren't part of the committee. I could tell you were a guest. You had no obligation. But you stopped, and you spent 20 minutes helping this woman resolve the problem, and when it was handled, you didn't mention it to anyone. You simply went back to the event," Diana remembered. A young woman with a catering manifest and the expression of someone 2 minutes from crying. "I watched you do that," Drago said, "and I thought..." He stopped. The briefest pause. "I thought that was someone worth knowing." The sitting room was very quiet. "You didn't approach me," she said. "No." Something moved across his face. What would I have said? A man like me, approaching a woman like you at a charity function. He looked back at the window. I noted it, and I moved on. And then my name appeared in the accounts. 3 weeks later. Yes. His jaw tightened. When I saw it, I didn't process it the way I would have processed another civilian name. I recognized it. And I began investigating immediately, not purely as an operational concern. A pause. I was already trying to understand what had happened to you before you knew you needed anyone to. She absorbed this. The fire in the grate had burned low, casting the room in amber and shadow. Outside, the snow continued its unhurried descent. "When you stopped at the terminal," she said slowly, "you already knew it was me." "Yes." "You already knew I was innocent." "Yes." "And you still asked what happened." She looked at him. "Why? If you already knew." "Because you deserve to be asked," he said simply. "Because no one else had." The words arrived quietly and settled deep. She looked at this man feared across the city, whispered about in careful company, a man who raised 3 children alone and read documents standing up and chose his words like a man who understood their weight. A man who had seen her do one unremarkable act of quiet kindness in a crowded room and had, without telling her, decided she mattered. Her eyes were bright. She didn't look away. "You didn't save me," she said. Her voice was steady and certain. "I want you to understand that. I saved myself." "I know," he said. "But you asked," she said. "And then you listened." He looked at her. The controlled composure present, as always, but beneath it, visible now, something that had been behind glass for a long time and had finally been permitted to exist without the barrier. "I have not," he said carefully, "allowed myself to care about someone in a very long time." "I know," she said softly. "I'm not certain I know how to do it without—" He stopped. "Without controlling it," she offered. He held her gaze. Something in it shifted, acknowledging, without deflection, that she had seen him accurately. "Then don't control it," she said. "Just let it be whatever it is." He was very still. Then he reached out slowly, with the deliberateness of a man making a considered choice, and tucked a strand of hair from her face. His fingers were warm, the tattoos on his hand dark against her skin. He let his hand rest at her jaw for a moment. Just that, just the warmth of it, the decision of it. From upstairs came the sound of small feet crossing a floor. Pavel, almost certainly, conducting one of his late-night engineering assessments of the bathroom tap. They both heard it, and both, without quite deciding to, smiled. Not at each other, at the same thing, at the ordinary, improbable, quietly miraculous fact of the moment they were standing in. His hand lowered, but the distance between them did not return to what it had been. She turned back to the window. The snow was still falling, patient and unhurried, the way good things sometimes are. Morning arrived clear. The snow had stopped some time before dawn, and the city outside the tall windows was white, and still the particular stillness of a world that has been covered and made unfamiliar. Every hard edge softened, every ordinary surface transformed into something that required a second look. Diana stood at the kitchen window with her coffee and looked at it. She had slept well. This was still new enough to notice. The first nights in this house she had catalogued the ceiling above her bed, mind cycling through accusations and divorce papers and routing sequences until exhaustion made the decision for her. Now she simply slept. The house had become, without her formally deciding to allow it, something that felt like ground beneath her feet. Petra arrived and began the morning without ceremony. The range came on. The smell of bread moved through the kitchen. Then Pavel appeared in the doorway. He was still in his pajamas, dark blue, printed with something Diana had been told were rockets but looked, she privately thought, more like agitated cucumbers. His hair was at a significant angle. He carried, for reasons he did not explain and she had learned not to question, a single blue sock. He surveyed the kitchen, located Diana, crossed directly to her and leaned against her side with the complete, unself-conscious ease of someone who had simply decided this was a reasonable thing to do. She looked down at him. He looked up at the window. "It snowed," he said. "It did. A lot. Quite a lot, yes." He considered this. "Can we go outside?" "After breakfast." He accepted this condition and remained leaning against her, apparently satisfied with the arrangement, until Petra placed his bowl on the table and the gravitational pull of honey reasserted itself. Diana watched him go. She held her coffee with both hands and felt something move through her chest, warm, quiet, weightless. The kind of feeling that doesn't announce itself because it has nothing to prove. Nico and Mara came down together. Mara with her tablet. Nico with the slightly rumpled dignity of a 7-year-old who considers mornings a reasonable but imperfect arrangement. They sat. Breakfast happened. It was, Diana thought, an extraordinarily ordinary thing. 4 people at a kitchen table in the morning, the snow outside and the bread warm, and Pavel conducting a detailed structural analysis of his toast. Ordinary in the way that only feels ordinary once you understand what it costs to arrive at it. Dragos came in last. He was already dressed black as always, composed as always, the tattoos at his collar and wrists part of the geography of him that she had stopped seeing as separate from who he was. He poured coffee, looked at the table. His eyes moved across the children briefly, the quick accounting of someone who begins every morning by confirming that what matters is still present. Then they found Diana. He said nothing. But the quality of his silence was different from the functional silences of the morning. This one had acknowledgement in it. The acknowledgement of the previous night's sitting room, of the snow through the window, of his hand at her jaw and the word he hadn't said and hadn't needed to. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at her coffee. The formal exoneration arrived by document that afternoon. Federal oversight confirmed the closure of the fraudulent accounts. The 10 civilian names, including hers, were formally cleared of any association with the investigated transfers. Radu's confession, combined with Diana's documentation, had been sufficient to reclassify the entire investigation. The rival family connection was now under separate inquiry. It was, on paper, the end of it. She read the document at the desk in the office, the desk that had become, over the course of 10 days, simply her desk. The place where she worked and where Dragos sometimes came to stand behind her and look at what she'd found and say, "What else?" which had become, she realized, its own kind of language. She set the document down. She thought about what came next. She had an apartment she had not returned to. Colleagues who had sent careful, concerned messages she had not answered. A life that was, technically, still waiting where she had left it. She sat with this for a long time. Then Dragos appeared in the doorway. He looked at the document on the desk. At her face. "It's done," she said. "Yes." She looked at him. "I've been thinking about what comes next." He said nothing. He was very still, the stillness of a man who has learned not to reach for things, not to arrange outcomes, not to use the machinery of his authority to pull a person toward a decision. He simply stood there and waited and let her have the space to arrive wherever she was going. She loved that about him. She had not said so, but she did. "Your legitimate business operations," she said. "The ones being restructured. You need someone who understands financial architecture, who can build systems that are transparent enough to withstand scrutiny and efficient enough to be functional." She paused. "I'm good at that." He looked at her steadily. "You are. I'm not staying because I have nowhere to go," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm staying because I'm choosing to." She held his gaze. "There's a difference." "There is," he said quietly, "and I have conditions." The corner of his mouth shifted. "Of course you do. The children stay in their school routine. Whatever security arrangements exist, they don't interrupt normal life more than necessary." She kept going. "I work with full access to relevant documentation, not filtered, not curated, a beat. And you ask me things. When you're uncertain, when something is difficult, you don't manage me." He was quiet for a moment. "Those are reasonable conditions," he said. "I know." He crossed the room and sat in the chair across from her the way he always sat. Level, unimposing, deliberate. "Diana," he said. She looked at him. "I'm glad you stayed," he said, simply, without architecture around it. She nodded. "I know." That afternoon she took the children outside. The courtyard was deep in snow, and Pavel approached it with the focused ambition of someone who had been waiting all morning for exactly this. Nico followed with more dignity but equal enthusiasm. Mara walked beside Diana with her hands in her coat pockets, observing the chaos of her brothers with the expression of someone who has accepted that this is simply the nature of brothers. Pavel turned to Diana suddenly, snow already on his coat, his cheeks red, his eyes bright. "Aunt Diana," he said, "watch this." She had not told him to call her that. He had simply started, the previous day, and she had not corrected it, and neither had anyone else. And so it had become true in the way that things become true when enough people simply proceed as though they are. "I'm watching," she said. He launched himself into the snow with total commitment and absolutely no technique, and Nico immediately followed, and the courtyard filled with the sound of children being completely, unreservedly alive. Mara stood beside Diana and watched them. "He's been doing that all morning in his room," Mara said. "Practicing. Practicing falling? Practicing the jump before the fall." She said it with perfect seriousness. "He says the jump is the important part." Diana looked at the two boys picking themselves up from the snow, already repositioning for another run. She thought about that. The jump is the important part. She looked up at the house, at the tall windows, at the figure just visible inside standing at the glass, looking out at the courtyard, not performing, not managing, just watching the children play in the snow with an expression she recognized now, because she had learned to look for what was underneath the composed surface. He was happy, simply, quietly, insufficiently practiced at it happy. She looked back at the courtyard, at the snow-covered stone and the pale winter sky, and the two boys and the serious girl beside her, and all of it, every unremarkable piece of it, that had been assembled from a bus terminal bench, and a question, and a man who had crouched down to her level and listened. The snow began again. Light this time. The forgiving kind. She didn't go inside. She stood in it, and lifted her face slightly, and let it fall. She was not trembling. She was not alone. And the question that had started everything simple, quiet, asked by a man who already knew the answer, but understood that she needed to be the one to give it, sat in her chest, like something that had always belonged there. What happened? Everything, she thought. Everything happened, and it was enough. Thanks for sticking with this story until the very end. You're the reason these stories feel alive. If you're ready for another powerful journey, just tap the next video on your screen. And before you go, leave a quick comment and rate this story from 1 to 10. I'm excited to read your thoughts and connect with you in the comments.